easier that way. It's really great to be here and to have the opportunity to speak with you about what's happening in Israel. Before I start talking about the politics, though, I do want to say that we're all going through a crazy time. I'm 48 years old, certainly never experienced anything like this. The combination of the fear of the unknown, and both on the health level, on the economic level. And I just want to wish all of you the best, and you should be blessed with health and with your families, and everyone should emerge from the end of this crisis strong and ready to get back to life as usual, even though it's almost impossible to imagine. I'm going to get back to this in a minute, but the coronavirus crisis actually has direct impact on the Israeli political situation, and we'll explain how in a few minutes. The starting point, we actually have to go back to election night. It feels like it was months and months ago. It was just March 2nd. Election night, and when I say election, I'm talking about election number 3. It's confusing when you talk about Israeli elections, what election we're talking about. I was at the Likud headquarters that night, and euphoria. They were all, thousands of people were cheering, Bibi, Melech Israel, all right, Bibi, the king of Israel, and 60 seats according to the exit polls. They assumed that it would be 61 seats for his bloc at the end of the counting of all the votes. And just a few days later, we found ourselves in a very different situation. Netanyahu's right-wing and religious bloc ended up with 58 seats, not enough to be able to form a majority coalition of 61. And the Knesset gets sworn in. This is something a lot of people don't realize. After the elections are over, there's a Knesset. There are 120 members of Knesset. They get sworn into office. That is what the results of the elections yield. And then the process begins of going to the president and recommending who you think should be given the task of forming a government. So Netanyahu's right-wing and religious bloc came to the president, and all those parties recommended Netanyahu to be prime minister. So he walked away from that process with 58 recommendations, the 36 of Likud, 9 from Shas, 7 from United Torah Judaism, and 6 from Yamina. And that's Netanyahu's bloc that has stayed with him through all these last elections, through all his legal troubles. They have said that we're staying with Netanyahu, but that's 58, and he has no path forward towards a government. Then the shocking thing happened. As the other parties came through, at first, it seemed like Gantz had no chance to form a government. He had 33 seats of blue and white. He had 7 seats of Labor, Meretz, and Gesher. That takes him to 40. And that seemed to be it. But as 2 other parties came to the president's residence, everything changed. Avigdor Lieberman and Israel Beitenu with their 7 seats, they recommended Gantz to be able to try to form the government. And then the joint list, made up of 4 parties that are predominantly Arab parties, they also broke from what they've traditionally done, and all of them, including the more extreme Balad party, which is part of that faction, they all recommended Benny Gantz to form a government. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Benny Gantz has 61 recommendations. That's a majority. And the president essentially automatically gives Benny Gantz the mandate to form a government. He's given 28 days to try to form a government. Now you'd say to yourself, well, he had 61 recommendations, so that should be a 1, 2, 3 day process, and he'll have his government. Problem is that amongst the recommendations that Benny Gantz had are parties that were not going to be willing to sit with one another. For example, within Blue and White, there were numerous members of the party, some said it openly, some said it quietly, who said they do not want to be part of a government that's in any way partnering with the joint list. And I want to emphasize, because this is important, especially if you're out there and you'll hear criticism of Israel and Israel being undemocratic and apartheid state and things along those lines, we have to emphasize Arabs in Israel, 20% minority. They vote in the elections. They have the representatives. The joint list is in the Knesset. They're going to be members of committees. One of them will be a deputy speaker of the Knesset. The question at hand is having them in the government. And especially in this particular case, being the deciding votes for a government being in the hands of a party which has representatives who have said things which are quite problematic for Jewish Israel. For example, one member of their faction who in 2015 went on Facebook and praised Sami Kuntar, one of the worst, most atrocious terrorists in our history, who in a grotesque manner killed a 4-year-old Israeli girl on a beachhead. Someone, you can't praise such a person and then be part of the government of the Jewish state of Israel. You have members of the party who said that they think that it's time to maybe nullify the law of return, which allows Jews from all around the world to receive automatic citizenship in Israel. Again, that seems to go against the very fabric of the idea of a Jewish state. You have a member of Knesset, Ahmed Tibi, who's certainly one of the louder members of this faction, who is on video praising the martyrs for Jerusalem. So there's a discomfort from members of Blue and White to partner together with them. Certainly Avigdor Lieberman, who, if there's been any party in Israel that has spoken in an anti-Arab tone, it's been Israel Beitenu. He wasn't going to partner together with them. And the Joint List as well. They didn't feel so comfortable in being partners in crowning Benny Gantz as the new Prime Minister of Israel. Benny Gantz was the IDF Chief of Staff during Protective Edge in 2014. They view him as being responsible for ordering the Air Force to bomb in Gaza. They have a discomfort with it as well. But what was happening with all these 61 coming together? It wasn't to form a government. And Benny Gantz had no path towards a government. What was their goal? Their goal was, during this interim period of time, when there is no government, when Benny Gantz has the mandate to form the government, which, by the way, gives him control over the arrangements committee in the Knesset, but their goal was to use the 61 to vote in a new speaker of the Knesset, replace the Likud speaker, Yuli Edelstein, put in Meir Cohen from the Yesh Atid faction in Blue and White, and once they have the speaker, that speaker can allow any legislation to get to the Knesset floor, and they wanted to move forward with legislation that would remove Netanyahu from office. The legislation was going to say that if someone is under indictment, yeah, they're allowed to remain as prime minister if they were prime minister, but Netanyahu is just an interim prime minister. It's just a carryover from the previous governments, and they were going to make it illegal for him to continue as the interim prime minister, essentially remove him from office. They were going to make it illegal if there was a fourth election for him to be able to be given the mandate to form a government should he win. Basically say he can't run for prime minister. And this was an agenda they wanted to move through in the Knesset. So they put in a request for this vote to take place for Speaker of the Knesset. Yuli Edelstein, he's the Speaker of the Knesset. He said, I will not allow that vote to come to the Knesset floor. That's his right as the Speaker of the Knesset. He has control over what goes to the Knesset floor. And Yuli said that the law, the bylaws of the Knesset say you do not have to have a vote for a new speaker after an election until a new government is in place. And he said the reason for that is very obvious, because if you have an election before that and then a government is formed, you might end up with a Speaker of the Knesset who's from the opposition because his party didn't make it into the government. And that would be a nightmare for the Knesset. You can't have a governing coalition that has a Speaker of the Knesset from the opposition who won't let them move forward at all with their governing agenda. And therefore, Yuli said, I'm not bringing this to the Knesset floor. The Blue and White Party and others went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that he must bring this to a vote. There's 61 members of the Knesset who want it. He doesn't have the right to say no. And Yuli Edelstein, instead of listening to the Supreme Court's ruling, he resigned as Speaker of the Knesset and essentially left a void in the Knesset. Now there's no speaker to call this vote. I know Yuli quite well, had the honor of spending a lot of time with him and working with him. I actually understand where he was coming from in terms of not wanting this vote until we know which direction the government is going to go in. And also, he was obviously protecting the Likud party and his bloc from having these laws that would prohibit Netanyahu from continuing as prime minister. It is difficult, though, to hear of a situation where the Supreme Court is ruling something and the Speaker of the Knesset is going against that ruling. In a normal circumstance, the Supreme Court could go to the police and issue an arrest warrant for him. He's given immunity as a member of the parliament, so that couldn't happen. But it's he's ignoring the courts. On the other hand, you could say, but what right do the courts have to go into the Knesset and tell them what votes to bring to the floor? It's a real constitutional crisis in Israel, which is great for a country that has no constitution. So both sides can basically justify their opinions without any real backing in terms of what the laws have said before. What happened? The Supreme Court said, okay, Yuli Edelstein has left his seat. We're going to now impose a new Speaker of the Knesset, the most veteran member of Knesset, Amir Peretz, who is the chairman of the Labor Party. He is now going to be the Speaker. He is ordered to bring a vote for the new Speaker. And last Thursday morning, there's a gentleman who I served with in Yesh Atid named Meir Cohen, who was a member of Knesset. He had been the Minister of Welfare in the 19th Knesset. He woke up that morning going to the Knesset to be voted in as the Speaker of the Knesset. And Blue and White, with their block of 61, was going to plow through with the legislation. What happened along the way is that Benny Gantz, and it didn't happen just on Thursday, but it had been building inside of him for some time. Benny Gantz understood that if they brought that vote to the floor, and if Meir Cohen was instituted as Speaker, and they would try to move forward with this legislation, that basically meant Israel is going to head to a fourth election. Because Likud at that point would not even consider the possibility of any kind of a unity government. Gantz himself has no path forward. Netanyahu has no path forward. And basically by bringing this vote of a new speaker, he's saying Israel's going to a fourth election. And even though they might be able to, in the meantime, sneak through some legislation about Netanyahu and prohibiting him, it might not be so easy to do so. That law can be challenged in the court. It's a personal law against a sitting prime minister, but we're going to a fourth election. And we are here, just like everywhere you are, in the worst economic crisis and the worst health crisis that Israel has ever experienced. Unemployment is expected to rise beyond 30% towards 40% in Israel for a country that's usually below 5%. It's a catastrophe. Certainly health-wise, while on the one hand, I don't mean to minimize at all the deaths of 19 people, but Israel has a lower percentage of deaths per people who get the illness than pretty much any other country, but it's spreading. We don't know where it's going to go, and we don't know if we're going to have enough equipment for everyone, just like every other country is dealing with. And Benny Gantz said, we need to have a government. We cannot go to a fourth election. We must have a wide-ranging unity government, as stable as possible. There are new budgets that have to be passed. And that was a real decision of leadership that he made. I must mention the other calculation as well. Blue and White did internal polling, which showed that if we do go to a fourth election, Likud and Netanyahu is going to soar to 40 plus seats, and Blue and White is going to drop to 30 or less seats. So there was the altruistic side of we need to have a government to deal with this crisis. There was also the real politics of we're not going to be able to survive as a party if we go to a fourth election. And therefore, Benny Gantz made the decision, I am not going to allow this vote to happen for the new speaker. I am putting my own name up for Speaker of the Knesset instead of Meir Cohen, and I'll be Speaker just temporarily, and we're going to work towards a unity government with Netanyahu, and at that point, there will be presumably a Likud Speaker of the Knesset, or someone that we agreed to, and he made a very bold decision. And in making that decision, the Blue and White Party, which was this mammoth of three parties, of Gantz's own Chosen L'Israel party, of Yesh Atid, led by Yair Lapid, and Telem of Moshe Ya'alon, out of nowhere, Blue and White just fell apart because Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid, and Moshe Ya'alon, they disagreed with the decision to go into a government led by Netanyahu. They promised throughout the campaign, we will not sit together with a prime minister who is under indictment. They disagreed with Gantz's decision, and they put in a letter to the Knesset asking to break off from Gantz, just in front of our eyes. The only real alternative to Likud and Netanyahu just disintegrated. on live television. You didn't need reality TV last Thursday in Israel. You were watching it happen before your eyes in the Knesset. It was really something to see. So that was it. It seems like blue and white is, Yair Lapid and Moshe Ya'alon are going to the opposition, and Gantz is continuing with Gabi Ashkenazi and his party going into the coalition. Now, Sunday, there were a few things that happened that made a little bit of a difference here, because let's remember, Netanyahu has 58 seats in his bloc that are committed to him. Gantz is coming in right now with Chosen L'Israel that has 15 seats. How is that going to work? And he was asking in this government that the ministries be divided equally. But Gantz is so outnumbered in this government. The numbers did change a little bit on Sunday. What happened on Sunday? Two members of Moshe Ya'alon's Telem party, members of Knesset, Tzvika Hauser and Yoaz Hendel, both of them, by the way, former advisors to Netanyahu. They've been saying all along they believe Israel needs to have a unity government. That's what we need. And they asked Ya'alon if they can break away from Telem and join with Gantz and going into the government. Ya'alon gave them the permission to do so. And drum roll, please, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we had a brand new party in Israel. We need another party, right? Called Derech Eretz. This is the party led by Tzvika Hauser and Yoaz Hendel, and they're joining now. So now Gantz has 17 seats going into the government. But wait, something else happened on Sunday. And member of Knesset, Penina Tamanu-Shata from Yesh Atid, the first female Ethiopian to enter the Knesset. She also was a deputy speaker of the Knesset, really remarkable woman. She said, I want to be in the government. I think that we need to have unity today. I disagree with Yesh Atid's decision to go to the opposition. But she can't just break off from her party. But a really good thing happened for her. There is a Druze female member of Knesset from Benny Gantz's party, member of Knesset Marie, and she didn't want to go join the government. So this was straight out of any sport you want to choose. Right before the trade deadline, the two parties made a trade. And blue and white, Benny Gantz and Yesh Atid of Yair Lapid, they traded. These literally happened that way. By the way, you watched the Knesset committee, it was a trade that was brokered between the general managers. And there you have it. Benny Gantz stays with his 17, and Yair Lapid has his 13 from Yesh Atid, with 3 now from Moshe Ya'alon. They're together in a brand new faction called Yesh Atid Telem. They have a logo, they have everything, and they're going to lead the opposition for Israel with 16 seats. And Yair Lapid will become the head of the opposition, which is a prominent position. It's a position where you speak in front of the Knesset often, you meet with visiting dignitaries, you get security briefings, and he'll be leading the opposition from there. So that's the opposition, which, by the way, includes Yesh Atid Telem with their 16 seats, the joint list with their 15 seats. It includes Avigdor Lieberman's 7 seats. If you want to talk about the person who lost the most out of this election, it is definitely Avigdor Lieberman, who all along was promoting himself as, I'm going to broker the deal to bring out the next government. He's now just a regular member of Knesset in the opposition. There was a funny but sad picture going on WhatsApp showing Avigdor Lieberman on the streets of Yerushalayim playing a violin, asking for work, because he essentially is a member of Knesset in the opposition. You don't have significant abilities to do much. It's be interesting to see what happens to his party. And then at that point, it also included Labor and Meretz. I should mention that Labor Meretz was also part of another faction, Gesher of Orly Levy. She broke away from Labor and Meretz, and she's trying to find a way into the government as well. So that would be another person in the non-Netanyahu bloc and increase the size of the government as well. Since then, there's one other development which I'll mention on the party side, and then we'll talk about what's happening in these negotiations. And that is that Amir Peretz, the chairman of the Labor Party, has been in negotiations with Benny Gantz to join the government with his bloc as well. He would bring in the 3 seats of Labor that would break away from Meretz. He and Itzik Shmuli, his number 2, would join the government. There's talk about giving them both ministries. We'll get to that in a moment. Merav Michaeli, who's the 3rd member of Labor, said she's not going to leave the Labor Party. She's going to go into the coalition with them, but she's voting against the government. So that's going to be a very interesting dynamic to see as that plays out. Only in Israel that a party can join the government and one of the members is going to be voting against the government. But this really strengthens Benny Gantz as well. Again, he had the 15 from his party. Add Yoaz Hendel and Tzvika Hauser, we're at 17. If you add Orly Levy, we're at 18. If you add Peretz and Yitzhak Shmuley, he's now at 20, which is, again, not the 58 that Netanyahu has, but now we're talking about a 78-seat government. That's a strong, strong government. And what's very significant about that, from my perspective, is it means that Benny Gantz, for example, and his party, if they somehow don't get along with the government, you know what? The government could still last because he only has his 15 seats or 17 seats. That takes you down to 61 if you subtract it from 78. But even more significantly, the Haredi parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, which are 9 and 7, they're 16. We can now have a government where they don't have the power to bring down the government. And that could free things up to make some progress on some of the Haredi-related issues, on some of the religion and state issues. There might be some leeway there only because they don't have the power to bring down a government. So if there's going to be a unity government, it is good for it to be as large as possible, and therefore individuals don't have the power, individual parties don't have the power to topple that government, and hopefully that government can last for a long time. And that brings us to the negotiations. On Sunday night, Netanyahu and Gantz met. They met for 8 hours. They start these meetings at like 10 o'clock at night, and they met till about 6 o'clock in the morning. And they seem to make real progress towards a unity government. And they said just a few more things to work out, and we thought we were on our way. And then all of a sudden, some of the details started coming out about what that unity government would look like. Let's start first and foremost with Netanyahu and with Gantz. There's going to be a rotation for prime minister. Netanyahu will start out and serve as prime minister for the first 18 months till September 2021. And during that time, Benny Gantz will be defense minister. That's the first half of this government. And then there's half two, where Benny Gantz becomes the prime minister. That, by the way, assuming that it happens, is an incredible development for Israel, where we've only seen Netanyahu as prime minister for so many years, and now all of a sudden you'll see somebody else in that role. Again, assuming that it actually happens, that is, for blue and white's perspective, a fantastic success. But what happens to Netanyahu in September 2021? He cannot be a regular minister in the government. Netanyahu is indicted. His trial is starting at the end of May. People are saying his trial will take a minimum of 3 years, to go through the process. And Israeli law does not allow a minister in the Israeli government to serve while under indictment. So what is Netanyahu going to do? He's not going to leave the government completely. So and Benny Gantz has apparently agreed to this, that this new government will pass a law which says that while it's true you cannot be a minister while under indictment, but you can be a deputy prime minister with no minister responsibilities, and you can be a member of the security cabinet. And that's what Netanyahu's position would be in September 2021, deputy prime minister and member of the security cabinet. That's controversial for Benny Gantz's voters and his support base to move forward with that law. But again, Benny Gantz is saying we need a unity government. We need it for Israel to heal after this year of elections. We need it for the coronavirus crisis. And therefore, I'm giving up on certain things that I believe in to make that happen. So that's in terms of the two of them. Then there was a lot of other wheeling and dealing and real issues when it came to the minister positions. We were possibly talking about a government which could be 30 plus ministries. If you have a chance after we finish, I wrote a column today for Times of Israel called Yes to a Unity Government, No to an Oversized Government. There's no need for a government of over 30 ministries. I mean, you start hearing about the names of these ministries and it's a joke. The United States of America has 15 departments that we have secretaries of in the cabinet, and Israel is going to have 30 plus. It's crazy. And especially in a time when Israelis are suffering. I mean, people don't have a livelihood, to see all these new ministries created and people getting very high salaries and all the workers and the perks that come with the positions. It's not going to go very well in Israel if this happens. But Netanyahu has promised Gantz equality in terms of the ministries, because Gantz wants to make sure that he's not just a minority member of this coalition. They're equal. This is half-half. So whatever number of ministries there are going to be, they have to be half-half. So if it's going to be 30, that means 15 ministers for each side. Think about that for a moment for Benny Gantz's side. Put aside Likud for a moment. Let's say his bloc reaches 20, together with Labor and together with Orly Levy. That means that out of 20 members of Knesset, 15 are going to be ministers. That leaves him with just 5 members of Knesset within the parliament for all the legislative work, for all the committee work. I can tell you, having served in the Knesset, it's impossible. So Benny Gantz is exploring different ideas, including the possibility of using expert professionals for some of the ministries to try to free up some of the space for him to have members of Knesset. They're also talking about possibly passing what in Israel is called the Norwegian law. It's so funny in Hebrew to hear it, the Chok HaNorvegi, where they're going to take the Norwegian model where ministers leave their posts as members of Knesset and new members who are further down on the list come in as members of Knesset. So that might be another way to expand his base within the Knesset. That's one issue which Benny Gantz has to deal with. Netanyahu has to deal with a whole bunch of other issues. Right now, at this moment, there are 16 ministers from the Likud party. 16, as we speak right now. He's going to get 15 ministries at most. 5 of them he has to give to his coalition partners, to Yamina, to United Torah Judaism, to Shas. That leaves about 10 for Likud. And there is tremendous tension right now in Likud, people trying to fight for those positions. They're talking about possibly expanding the cabinet to 36 seats to make sure that everyone that wants the ministry can get one. They're talking about possibly giving people ambassador positions instead of becoming ministers. I don't know when it became so bad to be a member of Knesset. That's what I wrote about in my article, Times of Israel. But they all want to be ministers. And they're talking about Ophir Akunis, for example, who's the current welfare minister, that he might go and become the UN ambassador. Zev Elkin, who's currently the environmental minister, might become the ambassador to Russia. All kinds of other ideas to try to free up some of these minister positions. But aside from the issue of the ministries for each party to get, there is another major issue which has to be dealt with. And that is, Benny Gantz is saying, I do not want to allow Yaakov Litzman, the chairman of United Torah Judaism, to continue as the health minister. There is a lot of criticism about the health ministry deteriorating under his watch over the last 5 years, and that partially played a role in us not being prepared for the coronavirus crisis. And the medical system here, they're all saying we need a professional from the medicine community to be the minister. He needs to be removed from office. There's also the fact that, surprise, he's under investigation as well and might be indicted for criminal offenses, and therefore they do not want him to be the head of the health ministry, and they're saying we cannot move forward with these negotiations if you insist, Netanyahu, on him being in that position. At the moment, Netanyahu is not budging on that for whatever internal reasons he has with United Torah Judaism, and at the moment, he's their candidate for health minister. That's one impasse which we have reached. Another impasse that we have reached relates to the issue of the Speaker of the Knesset. Netanyahu wants Yuli Edelstein to go back to his position. He sacrificed himself, if you would, for the sake of Likud and for the sake of Netanyahu. And Gantz is not budging. He's saying this is a person who went against a ruling of the Supreme Court. We cannot have him in that position. That has to be worked out. I actually proposed on Facebook something a few days ago, and I'm hearing that it's actually being talked about right now. And I said they should give Yuli the position of foreign minister. He would be excellent in that position, and that's not a step down from being Speaker of the Knesset, and apparently that has returned to the table as a possibility. We'll see how that gets worked out. Another issue, though, is the Justice Ministry. Benny Gantz is getting the Justice Ministry for his party. And remember, the previous Justice Minister in a real government was Ayelet Shaked from Yamina, right-wing, conservative. She moved forward with a whole conservative agenda, dealing with the courts, dealing with the relationship of the courts and the legislature, dealing with getting conservative judges onto the court, paving the way for annexation of areas on the West Bank, other areas as well that she worked on. And who does Benny Gantz want to put in as Justice Minister? Avi Nissenkorn, who was the head of the union, the chief of the union movement in Israel, very, very left wing. and Yamina and Likud, they're saying there's no way we can have this person as the justice minister, and this is another place where there's an impasse. And for the first time, we've heard over the last few days, for example, Miki Zohar, a member of Knesset from Likud who's involved in negotiations, he said, a unity government is important, but we're not at the expense of everything. We're not selling everything we believe in for this. We have our agenda. There is disagreement between Netanyahu and Gantz about do they accept the terms of President Trump's plan for the Middle East, which might allow for Israel to apply sovereignty to areas of the West Bank. Netanyahu wants that to be part of the government agreement, and Gantz at the moment is not agreeing to that. So there are significant issues right now that are separating between the two of them. And for the first time, we're hearing rumblings again about the possibility of a fourth election. By the way, the polls show if there's a fourth election, sure enough, the public polls show Netanyahu would get 40 seats. Gantz and his party would have 13 seats. Yesh Atid would go down to 11 seats. Netanyahu would have an easy government on his own. So everyone's going to try to avoid that happening. So we don't know exactly where things are going. That's a little bit of an update in terms of where things stand now. The next few days are going to be very significant. I will tell you, Israel needs this government. They need to make this work. We need the budgets passed to deal with the crisis that we're dealing with. And the country as a whole has to heal. We cannot go through a fourth election of all the mudslinging again. So I certainly hope that it happens. I'm going to end with just one point, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Very often when I talk about this topic, it could be depressing. It's sad that Israel spent a year and we cannot find a way to put together a government. It's a little bit embarrassing sometimes, certainly when you speak about it overseas. But I always emphasize one point. I think to myself, what is our problem right now? It's that we, as a Jewish state in the land of Israel, are trying to figure out how to put together our democratically elected government. What our great-great-great-grandparents would have given up to have this problem. Think about 2,000 years of the problems that we had in the countries where we lived. And I always remind myself, I would rather have this problem that we're dealing with today here than the problems that we had throughout the history of the exile and diaspora. So on the one hand, it's a very difficult time, and Israel does need to solve this problem. But I always remind myself that we're blessed to be part of this process of creating a Jewish democratic state in the 21st century. And Israel's in its baby steps in terms of world history. And B'ezrat Hashem, with God's help, we'll get this right. I certainly thank all of you for taking the time to listen, to be interested. I thank you for any work that you do to lobby for Israel, to advocate for Israel. We do need your help wherever you might be, and we're so appreciative for those efforts. And now I'll hand it over to Ellie to help us with the question and answer session.
All right, thank you so much, Rabbi Lipman, for all these explanations. If anyone has a question, just feel free to ask. I'll ask the first question. How are they going to make sure, because Netanyahu has proven many times that he's a pretty good political expert, how are they going to make sure that in a year and a half, when he's supposed to give prime minister to Gantz, how are they going to make sure that he does it?
Ellie's asking a great question. And by the way, Moshe Ya'alon and Yair Lapid and others said, Benny Gantz, you don't understand. Netanyahu is not going to keep to it. He'll find a way to collapse the government before he has to give up the premiership. He'll go to elections. He'll be strong. They're working out some kind of a mechanism to try to prevent that from happening. They're having some struggles figuring out exactly what to do. There was one idea which said, let's, at the same time, we swear in Netanyahu as prime minister. Perhaps we can swear in Benny Gantz as prime minister for September 2021, but that doesn't prevent Netanyahu from collapsing the government. Another idea is that even if Netanyahu does collapse the government, they would pass a law now, which says that Gantz is automatically the interim prime minister during the election campaign, so at least they'd succeed in having someone else in the position of prime minister. But they're trying to work out that issue, but that is a concern that many have within the Gantz camp, and they're trying to figure out how to ensure that this doesn't happen.
Oh, here I have a second question. If anyone else has a question, feel free to ask or just write it in the chat. I just got here a question. Um, oh, if now the poll numbers are so high for the Likud, wouldn't it be better for Netanyahu to just have a fourth election?
It's a great question. There are a lot of people in Israel whispering and saying, was this another political maneuver from Netanyahu to break apart blue and white? Now there's no alternative to him, and then just find a way for negotiations not to work and go to a fourth election. I have to be honest with all of you. Netanyahu right now is dealing with this crisis, and he's doing a great job in terms of leading it. But he knows that he needs to have a budget. He needs to have a government. People are going to die. People are not going to have a livelihood. And as cynical as we want to be and say maybe this was some kind of a sinister plan, I don't believe that was the plan. I do believe he does want to have a unity government. Again, what will happen in 18 months? That's a whole other question. But in terms of right now, I don't believe that he's trying to do that. I believe it'll be very sad for Israel if that was the intent. Remember, with no government in place, there's very little that he can do in terms of addressing the crisis. Right now in the United States, they passed this massive stimulus bill. We don't have the ability to do that here because it's just an interim government. And there's necessary moves that have to be made. And that's why we have to have a government in place as soon as possible. So I do believe he wants there to be a government. I do think he's a political master and he knows how to play the negotiating game, and he'll get as much as he can out of his negotiations before he has to figure out where he needs to compromise.
Thank you. Oh, here. Someone just asked, do you have a source, a website that you recommend to keep up with Israeli politics?
So first of all, I'll tell you, just again, I don't make any money off of this. You certainly can watch my Facebook page. I am posting throughout the day. It's on my profile, not on my page. Updates, election updates all the time. And I'm shocked by how many people say they're getting information from that. I do write for a news website that's called jns.org. So you can certainly look there. There's an article on there today outlining a lot of what I told you here. Certainly follow Jerusalem Post, certainly follow Times of Israel. Those are all websites that will give you very good update information. You can subscribe to their Twitter posts as well, and you'll be updated by all the wonderful reporters that are out there for all of those news outlets.
From Harrison. How can the Knesset best deal with the shortage of doctors and hospitals right now?
So it's a good question. The doctors are working overtime and the nurses, and it's unbelievable to see people in the health field and the dedication that they have. The biggest issue that Israel's facing right now is actually machines and ventilators for people who need those, and we're working on that issue. Unbelievable. I don't know, the Mossad, I don't know how they do this, but the Mossad has brought in enough testing kits for Israel to reach 30,000 tests per day. Somehow, out of nowhere, the Mossad got hold of 8 million masks for Israelis, and that's apparently going to be distributed. So there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes to make sure that Israel has what it needs. The number one thing that Israel has done, and it's done a really good job of, is having people follow the rules. We have very strict rules here. I go jogging every day. I jog around my parking lot. I'm allowed to go 100 meters out of my house. And for the most part, Israelis have really kept to those rules. We had some struggles in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods where the information was not getting to them and the rabbis were not being informed about what was really happening. And as a result, they were continuing praying together and having funerals together. And sadly, in Bnei Brak and other places, we're seeing a massive outbreak of people who have the virus. And we're preparing ourselves for that right now. The police are basically closing off those areas to try to contain it within those areas. But Israel overall has done a very good job with this. As I mentioned before, in terms of the rate of people who pass away, Israel's at 0.3% of people who have the disease pass away. Sadly, we've now seen younger people who have passed away from it. Just to give you a sense, Italy, where obviously was the greatest catastrophe, had 11% of people who had the disease passed away. So the medical field is doing everything that it can to catch up. Again, they were not prepared for what has happened, but there are a lot of things underway to address the need.
I have a question. Do you think that they will change the election system to prevent another situation like this one to happen again, where they have 3 or more elections? And like, are they considering it now? or is it something that you think they'll do in the future once they have a government?
So first of all, you're 100% right that Israel needs significant electoral reform. When I was in the Knesset, I worked on a plan that would deal with that in stages. One aspect of it was the creating basically regional representation, which we don't have. So if I have an issue in my town of Bet Shemesh, I have no member of Knesset who's beholden to me. I'm not a constituent for any member of the parliament. And that's one issue I was trying to address, trying to raise the threshold to have parties that are smaller not have such a role in the government. I failed miserably at my effort. Nobody wants to hear of it. You would think that after these 3 elections, that would be the #1 priority of the government, is to change the system. I have to tell all of you, while the American system certainly has flaws like any democracy does, after I joined the Knesset and was there for a little bit, I wrote a letter to my political science teacher from high school in Maryland, and I said, boy, now I understand what you meant by the wisdom of the founding fathers of America, separation of powers, checks and balances. It's a brilliant system. Israel needs to change the system, but shockingly, no one is really talking about it. You don't hear any of the leaders saying, we have to do something about this. And that's sad. I would definitely try to make it an effort. I have done little things here and there to try to put together some kind of a coalition to do so. It does not take off. Israelis are very much set in their ways. By the way, David Ben-Gurion left the Labor Party in the late 1960s because he felt that Israel needed to change its system. He said, we put this system together in an emergency situation in 1948. It wasn't meant to be the long-term system, and no one would hear of it. Remember, the people who have to vote for that change are the people who might lose their power if that change is made. And that's one of the challenges that we have. But you're 100% right that this last year has proven that Israel needs to have significant electoral reform, even if it's just a law that says if no one can put together a government, then the 2 largest parties are forced by law to sit together. It won't be a government which does anything radical, right-wing or left-wing, but just manages the country until we get to the next election. But at the moment, sadly, there's no discussion about any of these ideas.
So we have a question from Sheldon, who's asking a history-based question about the Knesset. Considering the precedent of the Soviet Arab Islamic Iran axis, has there ever been a motion proposed in the Knesset to permanently revoke party membership for the Arab anti-Israel parties and the communist parties?
So the communist side, not so much. No one's really talking about that axis today. Israel has direct relationships with Russia and other countries in the former Soviet Union. So there was really not that angle the way it used to be, for sure. So the communist side, less so. There isn't discussion about banning the Arab parties from running. Again, we're a democracy. There's 90% of Israel's Arab population vote for the joint list. They see them as their representatives. There have been motions to ban specific members from running for Knesset, because the Knesset laws say that in order to be in the Knesset, to run for the Knesset, you have to accept Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And those who are railing against the Jewish nature of the state, they're certainly in the case, certainly those who speak out in favor of terrorism and terrorists. And the Knesset, by the way, this time banned one of those members from running. And sure enough, the Supreme Court jumped in and allowed her to run, member of Knesset Izbak. So there's this weird relationship between the Supreme Court and the Knesset. The Supreme Court is still predominantly more left, even though Israel has definitely shifted as a population over the last few decades more to the right. And there was even, by the way, Blue and White voted that she shouldn't be allowed to run for the Knesset, and yet the Supreme Court threw that out. So there's really no effort to try to ban them. We don't want to ban them. I do want to say that as someone who worked in the Knesset with Arab members of Knesset, there are some who are certainly very moderate and you can work together with them about many issues. And then there are some who are more extreme, and it's the more extreme ones where it's really problematic. I don't think there's a parliament in the world that would allow a member of the parliament to get up to the podium and say some of the things that some of these members say. And the sad thing is that when they speak that way, then the Israeli mind starts thinking, well, are all Israeli Arabs this way? And they're not. The Arab Israeli population has significant numbers that are more moderate. I hope that over the years, they will elect more moderate members of Knesset Knesset who do represent the real needs of Israel's Arab population. They do have some real needs. So I hope that happens. But at the moment, there have many of their leaders are very extreme. And just remember what I said before, though. They're not only members of Knesset, they are in the committees. They will probably have a speaker, a chairmanship of a committee, and one of them will be a deputy speaker of the Knesset. And I think that's something which Israel can hold up as a badge of pride, that despite what the world might say, the minority population here does have full democratic rights.
And so then I guess this is going to be the last question. It's from Ariel. She's asking, why are you not in the Knesset? Why did you not run in the elections? And what are you doing these days? And are you thinking about going back to the Knesset?
Okay, good point to end on. So in 2015, my party that was in Yesh Atid went down from 19 seats to 11 seats. We lost many seats in that election, and I lost my seat because of that. And actually, 2 years ago, I left the party. I wanted to be more independent, and I felt that they veered a little bit from the path which we were on, which was a delicate balance of religious and secular, delicate balance of right-wing and left-wing. So I'm not a member of any of the political parties. I've been working pretty much full-time in Israel Advocacy. I work for an organization called Honest Reporting, put out a lot of materials for them, both in writing and videos. I just finished the writing of a book for Israel Advocacy, which I believe every single Jewish student or supporter of Israel needs to read before they go to college, before they're faced with what they're faced on campuses. It just gives you all the basics that you need to know to be able to, first of all, for yourself, be comfortable supporting Israel, whether you're right-wing or left-wing politically. That's not the issue, but just to have confidence in what Israel stands for, and then certainly to be able to advocate for Israel. I speak regularly to delegations, both in Israel who are visiting Israel and travel overseas. I do a significant amount of writing. I'm a columnist for Jerusalem Post, The Times of Israel. I'm a political commentator for I-24 and for IL-TV, and I write for jns.org as well. So I'm busy with all of those initiatives to just tell the world the truth about Israel. I'm also involved quietly in various organizations that work on the integration of the Haredim into Israeli society. This was what I really focused on as a member of Knesset. We've seen tremendous results. Thank God we've helped now over 60,000 young Haredi men get training, get jobs. We helped the establishment of the first Haredi Hesder Yeshiva, where they combine together Torah learning and serving in the army. And there's a lot of positive that's happening there as well. In terms of going back to politics, right now I'm very much enjoying my time outside of it, especially now, my goodness, over this last year. Don't want to be part of all of that. Enjoying my time with my family and in all the pursuits that I mentioned. It's possible that in the right circumstance, I would go back in the future, but we'll see how that plays out. I saw the question about the name of the book. There's a working name right now. It's not going to be the final name, but I'll be in touch with Ellie and make sure that all of you can know about it when it comes out. The working title right now is Just the Facts, but we're just finishing up the process. We just got a letter of support from Michael Oren, former ambassador to the United States and former deputy minister, and we're moving forward with the publication process. And as soon as we have the final name, after all the marketing experts have their say, we'll certainly let you know, and certainly hope that you get your copy of the book. And I just want to say thank you. Ellie, we're finished in terms of the questions?
Yes,
just want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you to Ellie. Thank you to all of you for this opportunity. Keep up the great work that you're doing for Israel. Stay strong during these very difficult times. And I hope that you all have a really happy, meaningful Pesach. Wait, one last question from Sheldon. I was on a big climax. Go ahead, Sheldon.
Hi, Rabbi, thank you for answering my question about the whether there was motion banning any parties or whatever. This will be really fast. Throughout the past 3 elections, was Kach even registered?
It's not Kach. There is not a member of Knesset. There was a candidate for Knesset named Itamar Ben-Gvir, who views himself as a student of Rabbi Kahana. He ran in a party called Otzma, and they struggled to cross the threshold. They have somewhere like 40,000, 50,000 people that support them. That's not enough to get into the Knesset. You need to win 4 seats. Each seat is somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people. And he tried to become members of other parties. Likud did not allow him to become part of Likud. Yamina, led by Naftali Bennett, did not allow him to be part of Yamina. And there was a strong sentiment saying, we don't want to have that element to be part of the Knesset. It's really small percentage of Israel's right wing. And therefore, they were essentially rejected from being with any other party. They had the right to run. There were members of his party who were disqualified from running. The court upheld their disqualification, which is quite shocking given the fact that member of Knesset Isbak was allowed to run. A little bit of a disjointed element between the right wing and the left wing on that front. But nevertheless, Itamar Ben-Gvir was allowed to run, but he wasn't able to actually get into the Knesset. But I saw how the international media jumped on that story. Oh my gosh, Kahana is back, and the Israeli right wing is extreme, and they're racist, and they love jumping on that without even mentioning that the mainstream right wing parties didn't want them to be part of their parties, and they were very much mitigated during the election process.
Yeah, so they took a break from going after Bibi.
Yeah. So again, thank you to all of you. Have a really happy Pesach. If any of you have any private questions you want to ask, feel free via Facebook. Ellie, you can give out my WhatsApp number as well. And I hope that we can continue the conversation and just share good news one to the other. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Have a good evening.
Good night, everybody.